Thank you all for having me here today. I have a long and complicated journey into patient advocacy. It started when I graduated from high school at 16 and my parents declared I was too young to go to college. And so they got me a job in the surgery department at what was then Suburban Hospital in Louisville. And my first day in the job, I was called into a surgical operating room and handed a leg and told to take the leg down to the lab. And I immediately threw up all over said leg. And then the next year when I started college, I worked all 4 summers as a nurse's aide in a long-term care facility because my grandparents had been residents in a long-term care facility for 10 years. And I had lots of opinions about things that needed to be changed. So then after college, life happened. I got married, I had children. I lived on a farm in Frankfurt, and I was looking for a new horse for my children. And I brought this horse home. It rained for a couple days, so I didn't get a chance to ride her. And then when I rode her, she became spooked. She reared up, I fell off, she fell backwards on top of me, and she broke my left leg in 12 places. And I had 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old. And it was about 3 years before I walked again. I was in the hospital here in Lexington for almost 6 months, and that was my first experience with a close call of patient harm. My orthopedic surgeon is someone I had grown up with, gone to church with, gone to school with, and he came in and said, "I'm going to try to save your leg." And I said, "No, you will save my leg. You do not have my permission to amputate my leg. I don't care if it kills me or not." So waking up from that, I was very, trepidatious about whether I was going to look down and see my leg or not. So anyway, I went through about 3 years of recovery, and then I decided that although I was getting the best medical care in the world, because I was on a floor of the hospital here in Lexington that was dedicated to horse accident victims, no one was helping me deal with how this was going to change my life. I had been very active, runner, a skier, a horseback rider. I was never going to be able to do any of that again. So I decided to go back to graduate school at UK, where I had went to undergraduate school, and to get my master's degree in a field called rehabilitation counseling in the counseling psychology department, which would enable me to work with people who had been victims of trauma, PTSD, death, illness, accident. And I did that for my entire career. So I was oddly prepared for what was about to happen to me. And I was living in Louisville, and I'd come to Lexington for a meeting kind of like this to get CEUs, a dinner meeting. I had eaten something that apparently caused some trouble. By the time I went back to Lexington, I had gone straight to the ER where they did a CT scan and told me that I had diverticulitis so badly that they were going to do a partial colectomy and take out a third of my colon. I didn't know I had diverticulitis. So I woke up from that surgery and my pain was worse than ever. And of course, no one believed me. They just said, "That's surgical pain, you'll get over it." I didn't get over it. I had an abscess at the surgical site that had perforated, and I became septic. And I was given antibiotics, and I developed C. diff. That was my first occurrence of C. diff in 2005. Over the next 7 years, I had 8 occurrences of C. diff. Some with surgeries where they were given to me prophylactically, once with eye drops for conjunctivitis, once for a topical antibiotic cream for infected poison ivy, once with no antibiotics given at all. But the last 2 occurrences in 2012 were the NAPI/B027 NAPI strain, as it's known, that's antibiotic resistant, and I was not responding to anything. And I was very ill. I was in the hospital. My doctors came in and said, by this time I had a team of 8 doctors. I had a colorectal surgeon, a gastroenterologist, an infectious disease doctor, an endocrinologist, a rheumatologist, a nephrologist, because my kidneys kept shutting down from the dehydration. And they came in and gathered around my bed and said, "We have nothing else to offer you, and you need to call your children and tell them goodbye." And my children are beautiful and brilliant, and one has her PhD in rehabilitation medicine, one is a corporate tax attorney in DC, one is an economic analyst for the federal government specializing in the VA healthcare issues. So they went into overdrive and they learned about fecal transplant being done in Australia. And they printed out 600 pages of reference material and brought them to Indianapolis, where I was living. And those 8 doctors said, "Never heard of it, not gonna do it, you're gonna die." And here I am thinking, this is 2012, we're in the country that offers probably the most advanced medicine in the world, and you're telling me there's nothing you can do. So my husband was a retired submarine commander, an engineer, and he said, "We're going to check you out against medical advice. We're going to go home and we're going to do a fecal transplant," which is what we did. And about 4 hours later, I got up for the first time in 3 months, took a shower, got dressed, and wanted something to eat. It was miraculous. And if I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't have believed it. So it took me about 3 months really to recover, and then by this time it was December, January of 2013, and my daughter, that's a corporate tax attorney, specializes in nonprofits, and she handles, if you name the 5 biggest nonprofits in the world, those are her clients. And I went to her and I said, "I can't stop thinking about all the people who have never heard about this, including the physicians. And in the U.S., 500,000 people a year are diagnosed with C. diff. 30% of those are the antibiotic-resistant kind, and so their only hope is a fecal transplant." So I just couldn't get it out of my mind. And I told my daughter, "I want to start a foundation." And she just cracked up. And she said, "You are a grandmother from Indiana. You don't have any money. You don't know anything about foundations. You can't do this." And I was like, "I want to do this." So that I kept percolating about it. And that May, she had a party at her house in Arlington, Virginia, for all the partners in the law firm. And there was a lot of drinking going on because it was Derby weekend, and we were introducing all of these Northerners to mint juleps. And I started talking to the partners in the firm about what I wanted to do. And by the end of the day, they all said, "We're going to do this for you, and we're going to do all your legal work pro bono." So before I knew it, I had a foundation, a 501c3, and on May 2nd in 2013, the FDA hosted what they called the first FMT public workshop. I thought, great. Other people in the public are interested in this. I'm going to go. I can stay with my daughter in Baltimore. So I went and I registered, and they handed me the attendance sheet, and there were 149 participants from industry and regulatory agents and pharmaceutical companies, and one that was a member of the public attending this public event. And this meeting was for the FDA to announce that they were not going to allow FMT to be done in the United States. And so I went to the moderator during a break and said, I need to speak. And he said, "No, we have a panel of speakers. If you want to wait till the end of the day, there's a question and answer period." So I turned on my Southern and I started crying, and I said, "I need to speak, and I'm not leaving here until you let me speak." And he said, "Fine. Go back to your seat. After this speaker, I'll point to you. Your mic will turn red, and you can speak, and good luck. And so I got up and told my story about how fecal transplant had saved my life, and at that time I had a 2-year-old and a 6-week-old grandson, and I told them I didn't want to die. I just wanted a chance to be able to live. And when I had done this, I didn't know if it would work or not, but it did. And the more research I did on it, I learned that the success rate is about 95 to 97%, which with a typical pharmaceutical, it's considered good if it's a 30 to 40% success rate. So I did get up and speak. I was nervous. I was crying. I'd never spoken in public before. But when I sat down, about 75 doctors stood up clapping and said, "This is who we see every day, and this is who is going to die if we can't do fecal transplant." So lo and behold, for the first time ever, the FDA reversed their decision and announced 6 weeks later that they would allow fecal transplant to be done for recurrent C. diff not responding to standard antibiotic therapy. And of those 75 doctors, about 50 offered to be either on my board of directors or my board of advisors. And so, bingo, I had a populated foundation. So since then, thank you. Since then, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe things happen for a reason. I found out about that meeting and went to that meeting for a reason. And since then, it's pretty much not been through any effort of my own, but more being in the right place at the right time as research on the microbiome has exploded. So subsequently now I work with the CDC, as many of us here do, on their antibiotic stewardship and antibiotic resistance programs. 2 weeks ago I went to another FDA public workshop. Now it's named microbiome-based therapeutics because we've expanded beyond fecal microbiota transplantation. Last week I went to the UN General Assembly where me and one other patient advocate, well, 3 other patient advocates were identified as global leaders in the antibiotic resistance movement, and got to network with the Secretary General of the World Health Organization and people in those types of positions all over the world. So that was quite extraordinary. So where we are now, it has come a long way, and this is the quick version of my 8 episodes starting in 2005, 2006, 2007, 2009, 2010, 11, and then 2 occurrences in 2012, and then in 2013 I started the foundation. These are my 3 daughters that celebrated with me after my fecal transplant, where it became apparent I was not going to die. And the history of microbiota transplantation, you know, everybody that I end up talking to thinks this is some new thing, it's kind of an alternative treatment, we don't know much about it, but actually the literature, the first reference to it is in 2300 AD by Pliny the Elder, a Roman naturalist. And then the next reference is in 4th century China, again in 16th century China and 16th century Italy. And these fecal transplantations at that time, they were called soup for the most part, and they were given orally to people suffering from digestive diseases. And the literature relates how it cured almost everyone. So then we get to the modern history. In the early 1900s, American veterinarians started using fecal transplant in large animal practice. And then the story goes that there was a World War II nurse on the front lines of the battlefields, and her father had been a vet, and she had a soldier with a gut shot that got infected. and she was out of options. And she decided to take healthy fecal matter from another soldier and pack his wound with it, and he recovered. And after that, a genius, father of fecal microbiota transplantation in the United States, Benjamin Eisman, published the first article in 1958, another one by Schwann et al. In the Lancet, then another one in 1994 by my dear friend Johann Bakken, who's a past president of the Infectious Disease Society of America. And then in 2000, Persky and Brandt, and Lawrence Brandt is also a past board member of the foundation. And then after 2000, it was kind of being done here and there, but there was no way to identify on the internet that it was being done. So as far as the FDA is concerned, they classify not just fecal, but all types of microbiota transplantation. If it's used to cure, treat, mitigate, or prevent a disease, it's considered to meet the legal definition of both a drug and a biologic. So that means two different things. That's two different divisions within the FDA. There's CBER, which is the Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research, and CIDER, which is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and they're both heavily involved in this area. So you've probably heard the most common indication for FMT is recurrent C. diff. The problem right now that we're facing is when I started advocating for this, one of my first moves was to start contacting the major insurers in the United States to get them to cover this. And I was always met with one of two, or perhaps both, answers that A, it's considered an experimental procedure by the FDA and they're under no obligation to offer experimental procedures. And B, my argument was my fecal transplant by enema cost about $12, and a colonoscopy to deliver fecal transplant cost about $1,200. And I was told 7 times by 7 CEOs of major insurance companies, you don't understand the insurance business. We have no interest in controlling our costs. If our costs don't continue to rise, we cannot justify raising our premiums every year. And that's why we're not going to approve this, even if it's not experimental, because it will save too much money. They didn't care that it would save people's lives. So anyway, now the indications have expanded to include digestive disorders, metabolic disorders, psychiatric, autoimmune, autism spectrum, neurological, dermatological, and adjunct therapies to cancer and graft versus host disease. And just for fecal microbiota transplantation, as of, when did we have to have these in? Monday? As of Sunday night, there were 210 clinical trials going on just for fecal microbiota transplantation. So we are only beginning to learn. A very nice doctor out in Arizona donated this to the foundation so that we could sell T-shirts. And this is kind of the response that we get from a lot of physicians. You know, here we have the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, and they're responding to fecal transplant as who let Stinky in. And the poor fecal transplant wants to know why everyone else on the transplant team is treating him like crap. So the current regulatory status in 2013 at that meeting, the FDA initially announced they were only going to allow this to be done if a doctor obtained an IND, which is called an investigational new drug application. It takes about 800 man-hours. It weighs 60 pounds when it's completed, and it typically takes between 1.5 years and 2 years to complete. And this is what really set me off at that meeting. So then 6 weeks later, they announced they're not going to approve it, but they're going to do something in a cute little term that they coined called enforcement discretion, which means it's not approved, but you can do it and we won't come after you. Then in 2014, they issued a draft guidance. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the FDA. The draft guidance is how they float out bad ideas and see how many people react to them. if nobody's paying attention and they don't react, they go ahead and institute the draft guidance. So in 2014, they put out one saying people could only do fecal transplant if the donor was known to them. Okay, there's a stool bank in Boston called Open Biome, and these are people who apply to be stool donors who think they will qualify, right? They're usually MIT, Harvard, Princeton students, usually in the sciences, usually very athletic, slim, no history of any risky behavior, antibiotics. Of that pool of candidates, 2.86% are approved as donors. So for a doctor to come to a sick person and say, okay, I'll do a fecal transplant, but you have to find your own donor, and you have to pay the $5,000 in testing and screening. That was ridiculous. So we in the public sector raised a ruckus. They didn't institute it. 2016, they issued another draft guidance saying we're not going to allow stool banks to be used, which is basically the same thing as the first one, just worded differently. And again, we threw a fit, and it was never instituted. So then in 2016, the NIH decided initially to fund a working group called the FMT working group, and we were going to be tasked. It was me, again, as the only patient, and about 30 regulatory people and physicians, researchers, attorneys. We were tasked with developing a legal framework for fecal transplant that the FDA could use going forward. And we met every 3 months for 2 years. And after the first meeting, we realized that the field is expanding so quickly that it's not just fecal microbiota transplantation, it's all microbiota transplantation. So they changed our name, and the next year, NIH and the American Gastroenterology Association decided to fund an FMT registry, which will soon be changed to an MT registry, so that we can have a longitudinal tracking of data, because that's what the FDA is saying is the holdup in removing the experimental tag, that there's not enough safety data. Although there has never been one adverse event, according to the FDA regulation, from fecal matter material. There have been events, perforation from the colonoscopy, transmission of listeria from a dirty scope, aspiration when an NG tube was used, but none of it has ever been traced to the actual fecal material. So then in 2018, we issued our working group recommendations, and this is about a 27-page document that I've edited down a little bit. And our recommendations were a 3-track system. If a sample comes from a known donor, this would be considered a practice of medicine and would only be regulated under state laws. The FDA would have nothing to do with it. If a sample is from a stool or donor bank, it would require the same regulation as a tissue or blood bank, which our decision was that FMT is not exactly a drug and it's not exactly a biologic because it doesn't contain human cells. And that's in the language of what qualifies as a drug and a biologic. It has to contain human cells, which this does not. So our recommendation was that a new category be established for microbiota transplantation, just as they have done for tissue, organs, blood banks. And they would have to register with the FDA and comply with rules for donor screening and testing. And then third, the modified products, or what we're calling microbiome-based therapeutics, which are coming from pharmaceutical companies, would be treated just as a drug and would have to go through all the clinical trials and get approval that way. And the kicker here is that because there's nothing on the market besides FMT that will cure recurrent C. diff, a lot of these pharmaceuticals have been giving breakthrough status, orphan drug status, and fast track status, which is kind of the triple crown of breaks from the FDA, which allows you to get to market much quicker with much less safety mechanisms and much more exclusivity way beyond the 7 years before normally someone else could come up with a generic. So all of these pharmaceuticals are pushing really stringently for natural FMT to be disallowed so that they can make money on their products, because there's no money to be made in FMT. And that meeting 2 weeks ago at the FDA, I'm the rabble-rouser. I got up and said, you can't do that. There's always going to be a need for FMT. I'm all for more products being out there, but there's always going to be people who only respond to FMT. Okay, so during this MT working group, most people say there are 5 biomes of the human body: gut, oral, nasal, vaginal, and skin. What we know now is that really every area of your human body has a very distinct microbiome. That includes your ears, your eyes, your mouth, your scalp, the space between your toes, your heels, your eyelashes, and eyebrows all have separate species and genuses of the things that comprise a microbiome, which are bacteria, fungi, archaea, and viruses. Research in these areas has just exploded, and in the microbiome working group, we had researchers from all over the world who are doing things like collecting secretions from healthy women with no history of bacterial vaginosis in an apparatus like a diaphragm, inserting them in a woman who's plagued with bacterial vaginosis and she never has it again. Or periodontists who are taking scrapings from people with no history of dental caries or periodontal disease, inserting them in patients' mouths, and their gum disease clears up, or they develop no more cavities. And the same goes on for every one of these fields, and I'm sure that there's more that we don't know about. This is what I was just talking about: indications for microbiota transplantation, dental caries, periodontal disease, bacterial vaginosis, yeast infections, sinusitis, allergic rhinitis, eczema, psoriasis, rosacea, conjunctivitis, blepharitis, tinnitus, otitis, vertigo, and we don't know yet what else we don't know. Okay, so these are the latest developments. There's a group in Washington that President Obama established called PACCARB, the Presidential Advisory Committee Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria. And several of us have gone every year and spoken. And then that workshop that I told you about, then the UN meeting that I just attended, and at all of these, microbiota transplantation has been recognized as a novel, non-antibiotic therapy, which is what one of the pushes is for, because we know even if more antibiotics are developed, the organisms are going to develop resistance to them. That does not seem to be the issue in microbiota transplantation. There doesn't seem to be an element of resistance. And this is my family as of this summer. I now have 7 grandchildren. The oldest is 7. So, if I had died, I wouldn't be here to see any of those. And I'm just one of the roughly 150,000 people a year that need a fecal transplant for recurrent C. diff, not mentioning all these other indications. My takeaway from all this is always trust your gut. Your brain can be fooled. Your heart is an idiot. But your gut is actually talking to you all the time through your vagus system, your nerve system. And if you get that little feeling that something's not right, it's not right. So we all need to learn to deal with that.